Hey pilots, Lykosar here, and I'd like to welcome you to a new series that I'm starting, the PvP podcast. And the inspiration for this series came from a YouTube comment actually, where someone asked me, Lyko, you seem to be having fun in this flight model, although a lot of people are unhappy. Could you give your thoughts on it? And initially I began replying directly to this comment, but once I hit the character limit, I realized that this matter deserves a separate video. And then it got me thinking there's a lot of topics that I want to discuss in regards to PvP. Address a lot of other people's opinions and many critiques and many words of praise alike. And specifically in this episode, I'd like to go into where we've been since 3.5 hit, since that's when I really started to get into PvP, how the gameplay mechanics changed in the various patches since then, and the tactics and metas that evolved from them, where we are now, and where I hope we might go in future patches. So before I begin speaking on that subject, I'd like to describe my credentials. I mean, who the hell am I to talk about PvP? For myself, I became a backer in 2016. I got myself a shiny M50 and I hopped into the hangar module just to get a feel for the controls, and after getting about 8 frames per second, I realized it probably would be a while till I could really play this game. So I shelved it for the time being, and then when object container streaming or client-side OCS hit, I finally got a playable frame rate and I started playing primarily PvE missions, doing the NPC bounties and the like, and towards the end of 3.4 I started to dabble in PvP. Now at the time, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. To me, PvP combat was all about getting into a circle strafe, adding a little bit of roll in there. That is pretty much the summary of most of the fights that I got into in 3.4 PvP. Now, of course, on the high end, at the top of the skill level, there were some crazy things happening. I mean, you had flick shots, you had absolutely wild maneuvers, and I'm sure if I hopped into Arena Commander, I would have had my ass handed to me, rightfully so. But then something happened. 3.5 hit, and with it came a brand new flight model, and a lot of people were unhappy. The notable changes, of course, were severely reduced strafe accelerations. There were no longer discrete landing modes, SCM modes, and cruise modes. You can achieve any velocity at any time. I really didn't have a seat to complain from because I hadn't really gotten everything that the previous flight model had to offer me. I hadn't reached that highest level of skill, and I hadn't realized what the flight model in 3.4 was really capable of. And many people are in the same scenario now that I personally was in 3.4. It's really hard, in my opinion, to accurately judge a flight model and game mechanics until you've gotten all you possibly can out of them. And that necessitates mastery, or getting as close to mastery as is possible. Do I think that I'm a master of PvP? Absolutely not. I learn something new against every opponent I fight, and I definitely still get defeated. But in 3.8, and I say this not to brag, but just so you know where I'm coming from and why I feel like I have something unique to offer in this discussion, but in 3.8, there wasn't a single pilot who could kill me consistently more than I could kill them. And I recall a particular scenario where there were 3 pilots, all in meta Gladii, who were attacking me simultaneously, and I was able to defeat them. Of course, I say all of this not to boost my ego, because part of what got me to this situation was accepting every failure that I had, realizing and accepting it, blaming myself for it, and learning from those experiences. So now that hopefully you trust what I have to say comes from a place of understanding in this flight model and the combat mechanics, Whatever critiques I can offer and whatever praise I can offer is seated in knowledge and expertise. So in 3.5, things were very interesting. When the new flight model hit, there were a lot of changes to combat as well, which I think when combat changes and flight model changes happen simultaneously, it becomes kind of difficult to judge what's the source of the issues and what is giving us enjoyable mechanics. In 3.5, shields were heavily buffed. At the same time, projectile speeds were significantly nerfed, strafe accelerations were reduced considerably, auto gimbals were introduced, or gimbal assist as they are technically referred to. A very controversial move which made many players who took the time to get very effective with fixed weapons and the like, and manual gimbals as well, it made them feel disappointed. Because all of a sudden we had a mechanic where, from their perspective, you didn't have to aim. And to some extent, I absolutely agree. Auto gimbals take out, especially the way they were tuned in 3.5, 3.6, and 3.7 with very fast tracking speed. They significantly remove the incentive to be absolutely accurate with your aim. So I definitely see where people were coming from. And to be honest, landing a hit with a fixed weapon when my org, for example, does fixed no shields practice, it's far more rewarding than when you get a hit with the auto gimbals. So 3.5 brought about a myriad of changes, and we were all still adapting. We didn't really know how we should be flying. There was no clear weapon meta because fixed weapons were also not working. You had to aim directly at the pip to get any hits with fixed weapons, and if you were outside of that little tiny pip at all, the fixed weapons weren't really fixed. They would gimbal to shoot at the enemy ship, not at the pip, at the enemy ship. So obviously, because of travel time, that could never actually result in a hit unless you're at an insanely close range. So there was a lot of jousting. There was a lot of circle strafing where people didn't really see much room for maneuvering because your strafe accelerations were so low. So it was some pretty... there were circle strafes with huge lead distances on the pips and people just tanking shots and firing, and it was basically DPS battles. A lot of people were simply unwilling to accept that auto gimbals were the new way. So 3.5 was kind of a mess in regards to combat. 3.6, well, probably towards the tail end of 3.5, people started to use attritions. One of the new weapons introduced with the introduction of Hurston in 3.5. Attritions were fantastic in that they did damage through shields even though they were energy weapons, and they kind of brought the TTK back into something that was remotely acceptable. They allowed you to engage and favored engagement in close range. And once it was realized that attritions were a viable option, flight styles changed a little bit. Up-close engagements between experienced players became all about doing a strafe and a gradual roll during the strafe. Sometimes counter-strafing, sometimes anti-strafing, but that's basically all that I was seeing in PvP at that time. It was a lot of counter-strafe and roll or anti-strafe and roll. And it was still largely about tanking your shots when your opponent got in close. And it was whoever could out DPS the other because strafe accelerations were pretty low. And one of the key requirements for positional combat was missing. Now, positional combat is a term that I hear frequently when people critique the current flight model. And I think one must really understand exactly what this term means. And unfortunately, there seem to be different definitions of it, depending on who you ask. One element of positional combat is putting yourself somewhere with respect to your enemy where you can land shots on them, but they are incapable of landing shots on you. Now, this is beautifully exemplified by maneuvers like the J-hook, which were all about, from my observation of it, I obviously didn't use it myself, but from videos that I've watched, the principle of it seems to be strafing down, so your opponent starts to track you downwards, but then quickly strafing to the side and then strafing up, so while your opponent is still looking downwards, you're above them, and now you can land a nice profile shot. Now, the problem with performing a maneuver like that in 3.5 was the strafe accelerations were low enough that your opponent could track you the entire time. If you strafe down, they have a lock on your pip the whole time you're doing that, and by the time you strafe back up and try to get the profile shot, they still have your pip locked down under their reticle. There isn't really room for reaction time to be the limiting factor, which is one of the things that makes positional combat work. Because if you think about it, two ships that have the same rotational velocities, if they are intent on looking at each other the whole time, one will never be able to leave the field of view of the other, assuming that they are both locking onto each other and intentionally trying to track each other to the best of their ability, because the two ships will have the same rotational velocities. So it is impossible. So the limitation has to be reaction time or something similar to that, because two of the same ships have the same rotational speeds. So positional combat was kind of out of the picture, except between two ships of a different variety. Positional combat in the vein that I described previously, which is only one form of it, of course, still exists. It still existed in 3.5 and still exists now between ships that have a significant difference in maneuverability. If you're flying a Gladius, you have enough of an advantage in strafe acceleration and rotational speed that you can quite comfortably get behind, for example, a freelancer or constellation, and it'll never be able to turn fast enough to bring its guns to bear on you if you are close enough and are able to strafe around it quickly enough. But this is something that between two ships that are equally maneuverable is pretty much impossible currently, because the strafe accelerations are too low, and reaction time is not a limiting factor, assuming of course that both pilots know how to turn correctly. So one of the key prerequisites for positional combat between two equally maneuverable ships is that the maneuverability of the ships has to outpace human reaction speed. So if we can't outposition, let's say I'm in a Gladius and my opponent is in a Gladius, if I can't outposition them, then how can combat become anything other than an aim race? Well, this is something that started being realized in 3.6 and was well understood in 3.7. So there are three methods of avoiding fire when you are within range of your opponent's weapons. Method 1 is outpositioning your target. Being in an area of space relative to your opponent where you can land shots on them, but they cannot land shots on you. And this is the primary mechanism by which light fighters engage large ships, such as freelancers or cutlasses or what have you. The second mechanism of avoiding fire is to make your pip difficult to hit. Now, this involves making your pip perform random motions. This is where roll comes in, so you can quickly change the direction of your flight. This is where changing your speed in the middle of combat, and specifically your strafe speed, comes in, because then you can make your pip move in unpredictable ways. It'll move closer to your ship, farther from your ship, upwards, downwards. And it's difficult for the human mind to predict where to put the reticle to land a hit. And the final mechanism of avoiding fire is making it so the pip is incorrect in predicting where you will actually be. Now, I'm going to go into this in detail in a future video regarding pip theory. Pip, of course, being predicted impact point. Now, landing a shot on something that moves as fast as a ship requires the projectile to be launched, taking travel time into consideration and the motion of the enemy ship into consideration. Now, the downfall of pip accuracy and their major limitation is that they are built on one big assumption. The assumption is that your target will maintain a stable velocity. Now, if your target changes their course or changes their speed in any way, they have an opportunity to dodge because their pip will be inaccurate. Their actual location after the travel time of that projectile elapses will not be where they were predicted to be. And that is the essence of dodging. Now, these last two mechanisms of dodging became most apparently useful once mass drivers became the meta. In 3.5, towards its tail end, when people were starting to warm up to using Gatlings and attritions which, of course, despite being energy weapons, did damage through shields, making them one of the few weapons that still had an acceptable time to kill. Using those automatic weapons, the auto gimbal lock-on rate, which is correlated with projectile speed, was fast enough with those weapons that there really wasn't much opportunity to make your pip unpredictable or dodge. Because even if you made your pip deflect in unpredictable ways, the auto gimbal tracking speed, if your aim was decent, was fast enough that it wouldn't really matter. The opponent's aim would be close enough so that your attempts at evading out of the shot would be negated, and dodging wasn't really a thing when you're facing a locked-on stream of projectiles. Although you could dodge maybe every fourth or fifth shot if you employed the strafing and rolling at the same time to fly in an arc, which was pretty much the rainbow roll maneuvering meta when attritions were the weapon to have. It was boring. The fights would essentially be get in range and then strafe and roll gradually or counter strafe and roll gradually to maintain an appropriate range. But when attritions were nerfed, as were neutron repeaters, and 3.7 rolled around, everyone started to use mass drivers because the amount of damage that they dealt was significantly higher than anything else if you were able to be on target. Also, because of the way shields worked, because we had shields that constantly regenerated under fire, and what I'm talking about is, of course, the meta shields being a combination of a constantly regenerating under fire stealth shield and a tanky shield to provide HP. The constantly regenerating stealth shield basically made energy weapons useless because you'd never be able to penetrate shields, or at least quickly enough to outmatch ballistics, which always penetrated shields. And because of the very high alpha damage, that mass drivers had, they would reduce the shield health dramatically very quickly for a brief moment. So if you landed another shot immediately after that, you could do quite a bit of damage, especially since all the shots were pretty much landing on the same shield face because there was very little spread among the mass drivers. All of a sudden, the latter two methods of evading fire became extremely important. Now, as I mentioned, the third method of evading fire is to dodge shots, to make it so that even if your target is able to lock onto your pip with their auto gimbals, they will not land a hit on you because you would have changed course or sped up or slowed down. So there's an overshoot, an undershoot, or a straight up miss because your course changed. Well, using only this method, through employing a maneuver called the stitch strafe, I was able to make it to the quarterfinals of the 3.7 tournament because this form of evasion was not yet apparent to everyone. And unfortunately, I didn't make it to the final match in that tournament, and I realized that my linear acceleration and deceleration was quite effective at getting the most out of evasion method number 3. I hadn't yet maximized it, and I hadn't really significantly tapped into evasion method number 2. I hadn't really started changing course as a means of evading fire. And that's when I started to add intermittent roll into my maneuvers, which you often see showcased in my videos. So the trick, of course, with pips is that whatever you do, whatever happens to the enemy pip, happens to your pip. So anytime you're trying to perform an evasive maneuver, the enemy is performing the same maneuver effectively because pips are generated based off of relative velocity. So part of becoming effective in 3.7 was not only learning how to make your pip unpredictable, it was figuring out how the enemy's pip will move in response to your own maneuvers and being able to compensate for it with your aiming stick. And in fact, when you became experienced enough, you could aim with both sticks because you could make the pip move in such a way that it would enter your crosshair. And with good timing, you could make a shot. And in some of the background footage, you might see that in my fixed weapons practice, sometimes I do that. I deflect my left stick in such a way as to move the pip into my crosshair. So one of the beautiful things about 3.7 was that the auto gimbal slew rate with the projectile speed of mass drivers was quick enough that pass-through shots were possible. And a pass-through shot is basically much like a flick shot, or really what flick shots were referred to by some, but I like to make the distinction. A flick shot I would consider where you're able to move your reticle directly onto the pip and take a shot, whereas a pass-through shot is where you move your reticle over the pip, and at some moment within that motion, your reticle will cross the pip, and you time your shot so that you fire at the moment it makes that crossing. Now, the auto gimbals were tuned very nicely in 3.7 in that pass-through shots were possible, but good aim was still rewarded. Because of the way these things were tuned, the Hornet, relatively slow medium fighter, was actually nicely balanced with the Gladius. And even the Arrow could make some amazing things happen. You could see my PvP compilations on the Gladius and the Arrow in 3.7 and see that you could do very well with the Gladius and very well with the Arrow. If I had the time, I would have loved to have made a Hornet PvP compilation in 3.7. Its combat strategy: keep close but not too close so the Gladius couldn't outturn you. Those extra 2 mass drivers you could have, despite the lower maneuverability, allow you to do some serious damage because you were just slightly more tanky, and the auto gimbal lock-on rate was fast enough that you could do pass-through shots. So it didn't really matter that the Hornet had this terrible problem where when it overheated, it would lose attitude control very quickly. So it kind of balanced it out, and I'm sure the Saber, if it didn't have the big shield hole in the front, would have been doing pretty well in 3.7 as well. So I was very happy with 3.7. Out of all of the 3.5 and onwards patches, I would say that's the one that felt the most balanced between at least light and medium fighters. And then 3.8 came along, and with it a much needed fix to the Saber, which now no longer had a shield hole and was once again a viable combat option. However, 2 things that I think may have adversely affected combat was the auto gimbal ring was increased in size, which I do not know what the point of was, because it seemed big enough in 3.7, but the tracking speed of the gimbals was reduced. And unfortunately, overall, it made aiming a less pleasant experience because now the tracking speed was slow enough that pass-through shots with the Hornet were no longer possible, and it stopped being a viable PvP combat ship, unfortunately. The other consequence of the lower auto gimbal slew speed was that oftentimes, even if you aimed your reticle directly at the pip, if the auto gimbals had previously moved to track a target exiting out of the periphery of your auto gimbal cone, then oftentimes if you were trying to do a pass-through shot or a flick shot, they would not have turned in time and returned to center in time to actually aim at the pip, even if your reticle was aiming directly at it. So it kind of made the aiming behavior less predictable, which I don't think was a positive change, because you want things to be predictable. You want things to behave in a predictable fashion and one that seems to reward good piloting. But overall, the final 2 mechanisms of evasion were still extremely important, and the added skill requirements of having to compensate for sudden acceleration, deceleration, and course changes with your right stick ensured that the skill ceiling would continue to be high. But we still haven't addressed a problem that plagues the new flight model, which is that there is no room for positional combat between 2 ships of similar maneuverability. And now that we're dealing with automatic weapon metas, namely auto gimbal Gatlings, where you can't really dodge shots or make your pip unpredictable enough to spoof the auto gimbal tracking, lacking the positional combat mechanism of evasion becomes particularly problematic, because now there's nothing keeping combat from being a DPS and aim race. And so that's where we are today. So let me conclude this episode with what I like about combat tuning in the flight model, those 2 topics necessarily having to be discussed together, since one directly affects the experience of the other, and what I think some improvements could be. Now, many may say that balance is not a priority at this stage of the game, and I agree. I don't think there are efforts being made, as they shouldn't be, to completely balance the game. But balance passes are constantly made, combat is constantly tuned. So it makes sense for us to advocate for changes and those efforts being put to directions that we as a community would agree with. So, what do I like about the current combat tuning in the flight model? Well, I like having an access to a full range of velocities as much as the game engine allows, as that is about as realistic as we could get. In space, all velocity is relative, so it makes sense for you to be able to go any speed. But of course, due to game engine limitations, we can't go any speed. But I think being able to get to Mach 3 or Mach 4 as we currently can is pretty good. I also like that to compensate for the fact that there has to be an artificial speed limit, ships with higher acceleration have a higher top speed, so they can catch ships with lower acceleration, as would be an inevitability in real space. So this is a nice workaround to be more realistic given the circumstances. Accelerations are also reduced enough to where even with Afterburner, there is no bee flight-like behavior. Although this isn't really a plus for me, I don't really care if the ships fly like bees because let's face it, this is 900 years into the future and even very small ships have artificial gravity. You can apply artificial gravitational fields to oppose g-forces and reduce the burden on the pilot. So 900 years into the future, especially, and given that we can accelerate to relativistic speeds very quickly and not disintegrate, I don't really care if there is bee flight-like behavior, but there isn't any right now, even with Afterburner. Slower accelerations, however, does mean that more timing and foresight is needed to intercept other ships without overshooting or drifting past them. Something I learned from months of team battles and practices with my org. Another thing I like is that the large main thruster to maneuvering thruster differential in acceleration production means that doing really cool oversteer turns actually makes sense in certain situations. And that is really fun. And another thing I like is that despite reduced accelerations of the ships, dodging is still possible, particularly when using cannons, because projectile speeds have been reduced enough to magnify pip deflection in light of smaller ship accelerations. Now, some improvements that I would love to see, and these are, of course, my opinions, but they are made in light of a large amount of experience in PvP. I believe the current ship accelerations with Afterburner should be the baseline at least. Ships are absurdly sluggish without this, and they have no chance of dodging fire, and interception without Afterburner is practically impossible, because you would have to begin changing your course or accelerating or decelerating far too long ahead of time. Another suggestion for improvement that I have is Afterburner should provide a quick burst of increased acceleration to allow a fighter pilot to outposition his opponent, counter such a maneuver, or intercept a target. If current Afterburner accelerations become baseline, then this new Afterburner will be enough to potentially overwhelm the reaction speed of an opponent and provide a window of opportunity to land unopposed hits. As a resource that would be heat limited, we should have a heat gauge plainly visible in our HUD like boost fuel used to be, so we can save it for when it is most advantageous. Not a sudden warning that we're overheating from the ship's audio. Given that Afterburner affects maneuvering thrusters, I think it makes sense for it to boost rotational velocity as well, in addition to translational acceleration, and this would give players an additional opportunity to outposition a target. This way, between two pilots using the same fighters, proper use of Afterburner can allow the offensive pilot to enter a dominant position and place his crosshair on the target before the opponent can bring his own guns to bear, or it can allow a defensive pilot to counter the attempt of his enemy to gain this upper hand. Because this revised Afterburner will provide an acceleration multiplier above an already higher baseline acceleration based on my previous recommendation, The defensive pilot will need to have quick reflexes and an accurate read on his opponent's maneuver. If we are continue to have auto gimbal, make the ring small enough so we can actually see with our peripheral vision whether we are locked on to our target or not. The current size of the ring in 3.8 and 3.9 is too large to see. Alternatively, have the reticle indicate to us whether we are locked or not. Also, why not have the tracking speed operate on an exponential rather than linear curve? At the periphery of the ring, the gimbals can track at a patch 3.8 speed or slower, but closer to the center, they can track at a patch 3.7 speed or faster. This will more directly incentivize good aim and train pilots towards using fixed weapons, which will eventually be the desired choice for experienced pilots. The suggestion of being able to exchange cone size for tracking speed is also fantastic. For the next episode, I hope to have some guests, experienced and well-versed pilots who've been around for much of the development of the game, come in and give their thoughts and opinions and perspectives. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the first episode of the PvP podcast. I'm your host Lykosar, and I hope you enjoyed. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. If you're looking for a friendly PvP community where skilled pilots offer training opportunities, join the Lykosar's PvP Academy Discord link below. If you're interested in the controllers I use and what my curve settings are, please check the description. See you in the next one, pilots. Lykosar out.